go live.
I'm always ready, as ready as I get.
And fantastic. Greetings, chess players, and welcome back to the free online summer chess camp. Once again, my name is Chris Torres. This is Daily Chess Musings, and today we are just thrilled to be joined by FIDE Master James Eade. Those of you who have been a fan of this channel for a while, you guys know who he is. One of our favorite guests. He's a FIDE master, so he's very strong chess player. He wrote one of the biggest selling chess books of all time, Chess for Dummies, as well as some other books, and ran the strongest chess tournament in San Francisco history, as well as served on boards with FIDE, that's the World Chess Organization, and the United States Chess Federation. So he has a lot of experience, and just a lot of fun. He asked me, and I enjoy this. You know, most of my friends will tell me what they want to look at. Jim is the kind of expert master that he is, and very laid back individual. He just says, "Hey, Chris, pick a cool game, pick something, and we'll go through it together." So I picked a game by one of my favorite chess players, Jose Raul Capablanca. Those of you who know me know I like having my PB&J for lunch. That would be Paul Morphy, Bobby Fischer, and Jose Raul Capablanca, right? PBJ. And then the other individual we're going to talk about is Rudolf Spielmann, which I think I looked at a Rudolf Spielmann game with Jim back during our free winter camp. But this game's a different one, and I know that all my students have never seen this one, so I'm very excited about that. So Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. And I love the little thing that you picked the game, and then I can comment as we go along. And so my I don't have an engine, and I don't have any other advice. So you're just going to get my take on the game, and hopefully, even if I don't tell you the best advice, I will tell you how I think about the game, and how I think about the game might be helpful for others. And that's the whole point. We're here to have fun and to be informative as well.
Yeah, the inner game of chess is very important. It's not just the moves that are played on the board, which anybody can study, but it's the thought process. And hearing a player like Jim explain his thought process about positions is going to improve your chess greatly. So the game I picked today comes from the San Sebastian tournament. San Sebastian, there we go. Tournament of 1911. It was played in Spain, and this was way before the Champions Chess Tour that Magnus Carlsen's running, all these things, right? This was 109 years ago, and 110 years ago. And but all the best players, well, I shouldn't say all of them, but a bunch of them went to Spain to play in this tournament because a guy named Rothschild donated a whole bunch of money. If you placed in the top three, you were going to get a bunch of money. So a whole bunch of great chess players went there, and including Aaron Nimzovich, Frank Marshall, all these guys. And Jose Raul Capablanca played Rudolf Spielmann near the end of the tournament. And a lot of people don't know it, but I believe Spielmann actually had an even score with Capablanca over his career.
I did.
Yeah. Rudolf Spielmann, it just incredible. I could go on about him for far too long, but we want to look at the game. All right, so
Well, before we
yeah,
get started, Chris, I do want to take a little walk down into the
sure.
past because this game was over a century ago. Sorry, let me decline that. And we have to put ourselves back to where was this and in what time was this played. So this is in a formative stage in chess. You know, we're coming off the Romantic era of chess, which was the best player of that time was Paul Morphy, and we're moving into what we call the classical era of chess, where Steinitz has written down a bunch of rules strategies that he thinks define the game. And then Sigrid Tarasch out of I think he played in this tournament too, right? He was a great player from Germany, and yeah, Tarasch played, and the idea here is that these guys were all coming together, and it's right before, or a few years before, World War I broke out. So this is still a time when people could come together. And pretty much the only strong player, well, not the only, but the real only player that we're really missing in this tournament is Lasker, who was world champion at the time. But all the other stars are out there, and it's won by Jose Capablanca, and it's 10 years later that he wins the world championship from Lasker. And Spielmann was one of the great players of that time. He was from, and we're talking about like the time frame that he's in. He's from what they call the German Empire. So, you know, it wasn't just the state of Germany the nation of Germany that we think of today. It was a very different country at that time. It was an empire, and it had ambitions and led it to us into World War I. So that's the time frame that we want to go back. It's a classical era of chess. This is before the hypermodern era. So this is not the kinds of moves that we always see in today's chess, modern chess, but it's a really good, instructive game from the classical period. And I always recommend people, when they start out, play over the classics. Play over the Romantic era games too, because they're fun, they're exciting, and Morphy is the master of that era. But Capablanca became the master of the classical period. And so his games are always wonderful. Spielmann was a great player, and I was a little surprised to hear they had an even score, but I'm not totally shocked, because Spielmann was such a great master.
Yeah.
So with that,
well, you bring up some interesting points. Chess had changed a little bit stylistically, since Morphy's time. But Spielmann, if there is a player who is a lot like Paul Morphy during this time period, Spielmann would have been one of those guys. He was a very swashbuckling, tactical, no holds barred. He's happy to sacrifice material. In fact, Spielmann was also a legal scholar, just like Paul Morphy, and devoted his time to chess, just like Paul Morphy did. Sadly for Spielmann, though, as Jim said, this was a tumultuous time in Europe, and Spielmann, I believe, fought in World War I. And then, of course, World War II was not very friendly to people of Jewish heritage, and he lost, I believe, a brother and a sister in the in the internment camps, and he was constantly running this and that, and maybe he might have lost two sisters. I'm trying to remember now, but he ended up being, just very sad from that experience. And Paul Morphy, of course, was very sad from the American Civil War. So there's just a ton of similarities that I found fascinating. And one thing just to throw out, I love throwing out these little hooks. Spielmann wrote a great book called The Art of the Sacrifice, and I have it on my bookshelf. I just love the book. And it really kind of codified the different kinds of sacrifices you could play and categorize them. And he wrote, at the end of his life, he was in Sweden. He wanted to come to America to escape the war and the trouble in Europe, and he wrote a memoir of his memories as a chess master. He wrote his autobiography, basically, and he was promised that he could come to America, and he somehow that never happened. And even though he wrote this great book, the manuscript is missing. It was never published. It cannot be found. So it's quite quite an interesting thing to compare Paul Morphy and Rudolf Spielmann. He was a kind of a Paul Morphy-esque player, but after the Romantic in the classical time period. All right, let's take a look at the game. Let's see. Here we go. So, as I said, this is round 12, so it's near the end of this tournament. And Capablanca starts with 1d4, Jim.
Okay. And we want to also mention that this tournament in 1911 was probably second to St. Petersburg 1914 in terms of the strength, the overall strength of the quality of competition. So in between 1900 and 1920, certainly during that period, this was one of the top two strongest tournaments. So everybody that was playing in it could give you a good game. And so 1d4. Chris, can you highlight squares?
I certainly can.
Okay, so I would like you to highlight c5 and e5.
Got it.
So this pawn on d4 is hitting those two squares. And what we want to talk about is the concept of the four central squares. And this is important to control these squares. Now, occupation does not imply control. So the pawn on d4 is occupying d4, but it's not controlling it at all. The queen on d1 is attacking that square. So that's what we think of in terms of control. And so the pawn on d4, though, is influencing the center. Look at how it attacks the e5 square. So the pawn on d4 is actually occupying d4, but attempting to control e5. Now, c5 is not in the center, but it's obviously very close to the center. So that's another important square. So d4 is a great move to open the game. It opens a line for the bishop on c1 to come into the game. And a piece's power is dependent on its mobility. At the beginning of the game, only the knights can move, and so only the knights have any power. But after d4, the bishop has the ability to enter the game and increase its mobility, therefore increasing its power. And the queen has a couple of squares it can move to now. So it's increased its power a little bit, but not that much. But d4 is a fine move to open the game. So what did Spielmann
Rudolf Spielmann played d5.
d5. So the same things can be said about d5 that have been said about d4. But the only thing that I want to add now, if you can highlight the squares c3, e3, e6, and c6.
c3, e3, e6, and c6.
Now I've said all the good things about these pawn moves, but there is one drawback, in that these pawns can never influence. They've given up any possibility, because pawns cannot move backwards of controlling those squares. So they are not threatened to be occupied by the opponent right now, but it's a very minor weakness, but it is a drawback. As you advance your pawns, they can no longer move backwards. They can no longer participate in the attempt to control any squares that they have left behind. Okay, so what did Capablanca play?
He played knight to f3.
Okay, so we're developing the knight. This is always a good move. And f3 is obviously its preferred square, because it's attempting to control e5 and d4. So these center squares have been attacked by the knight or defended by the knight, and the knight now has increased its mobility. Back on g1, it could only move to two squares, but now that it's on f3, it can move to d2, e5, g5, h4. So it's a more powerful piece posted on f3 than it was on g1. So this is a good move. There's really no real drawback. The only drawback to it is that f2 f2 pawn cannot advance. But in these types of games, the f2 pawn's advance is not likely. So it's really, it's hardly any criticism of this move and quite a few good attributes. So what did Spielmann play?
He played 2c5.
Okay. Now, as Chris was telling you, Spielmann is an aggressive player. You know, he likes combinations, he likes sacrifices, but basically his characteristic play is aggressiveness. So white has occupied the d4 square, so Spielmann attacks it. This is consistent with an aggressive player. It's an aggressive strategy. So the pawn on c5, the only drawbacks is it can no longer influence the d6 or b6 squares. On c7 it can help to control those squares. But he's saying, I want to attack the center with it. And that little drawback of not being able to control the squares behind me, I'm not too concerned about that. I'd rather attack. So he's contesting the d4 square, which is now protected by the knight and queen. It's not in danger of being lost, but he's attacking it and saying, I don't want you to maintain that pawn on d4. So it's a very, the first opening salvo is a sign of aggression from black. So what did Capablanca do?
3c3.
Okay. Now, obviously, Capablanca says, I want to maintain a pawn on d4. So if you take it, I will recapture with the pawn that I just moved to c3. So, you want to take it, I will retake it, and I'll still have that pawn on d4, and I'll still control e5, and there's not much you can do about it. So the drawback of that is it takes away the natural square for the white knight on b1. The knight would love to come to c3, where it can influence the center, much like the knight did from moving from g1 to f3. However, it cannot now because there's a pawn there. So it can only enter the game and influence the center through the d2 square. So there's a little bit of a drawback to the c3 move. There's the asset that it's supporting the pawn on d4. The drawback is that it's taking the c3 square away from the knight. So what did Spielmann do?
Spielmann played 3 knight f6.
Okay, just like knight f3 for white, knight f6 for black does the same things. It fortifies the pawn on d5, and it attacks white's e4 square. You notice the pawn attacks white's e4 square. That I say it's white's e4 square because it's on white's side of the board. And that square is now attacked twice, by the knight and by the pawn, and there's no white piece or pawn that is contesting it. So it seems like white has got a little bit of an iron grip on the e5 square, and black is countering with pressure and nearly controlling the e4 square. So this game looks pretty equal to me. The difference is that black's pawn is on c5 and white's pawn is on c3. So already black is taking a little bit of a more aggressive tone than white is. So Capablanca does what next?
4e3.
4e3. Okay, so now we're coming into what we call the Collie system. And that's just a system of play where the white pawns go on black squares. And I like systems like this because, I can remember them. Okay, I have white, so I put my pawns on black squares. And if I have black, I put my pawns on white squares. I'm just kidding a little bit, but that it's really a characteristic of many players to play pawns that it's take your share of the center and hold on to it. Put a lock on the squares that you control. And so e3 has the additional benefit of opening up a line for the c1 square, bishop on c1. The bishop on c1 can now come into the game. Previously, it could not. So this is a good move from the white bishop's perspective. But what about the white bishop on f1? But what about the bishop on c1? From its perspective, its mobility has been reduced. So most moves in chess, other than checkmate, have benefits and drawbacks, and we have to weigh them. This is the thought process that goes before you make a move. You weigh what's good about it, and you think about what's bad about it. And unfortunately, the bishop on c1, which had an open diagonal, now is biting on its e3 pawn. It can't go past. It can't go to the e3 square, let alone further along that diagonal. So its mobility has been severely reduced, and a piece's power is tied to its mobility. So the bishop on c1 is going wah, 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 then the bishop on f1 is happy as could be. So now, what does black do?
Knight c6.
Okay, this is very aggressive. Again, consistent with what Chris has told you about Spielmann, his nature, aggression, because he's now fighting for the control over the e5 square, which white is trying to hold on to. The d4 pawn attacks it, the knight on f3 attacks it, and now black has moved a piece that now threatens that control. It's only one piece versus two, so it's not controlling it, but it's adding to the threat. Now there is another, that's a good thing, it's a good move, and one of the drawbacks is, what about that pawn on c5 now? That pawn on c5 can be captured and cannot be recaptured. So is it hanging? Is it free for the taking? I think we're going to find out in just a moment. So Capablanca does what?
5 dx c5.
So he does take it. He says, you're very aggressive. You're willing to sacrifice pawns. I know that about you. Well, the only way to refute a sacrifice is to accept it. That's what Capablanca is saying. And this is a theme of classical chess. The only way to refute a sacrifice is to accept it. Take the material, take the units of force away from black. So white now has a material advantage. So it has cost an element of time. It has cost one move to take one. And Capablanca says that's a good trade for white. Spielmann was willing to do this because what's Spielmann's next move?
e5.
e5. So this pawn on d4, which took the pawn on c5, gave up its control of this e5 square. And so the knight on c6 is now supporting the pawn on e5. And, oh my goodness, it looks like black has the advantage in the center. It's attacking the e4 square twice, which white has nothing to offer there on e4. So you've got the e4 square. The d4 square is contested because the pawn on c3, the pawn on e3 attacks it. The knight on f3 attacks it. The queen on d1 attacks it. And black has the knight on c6 that attacks it, but now it has a pawn on e5 that attacks it. So we call that contested. Nobody controls it. So the d5 square is occupied by a pawn and defended by a knight on f6 and a queen on d8. So that square seems to be in black's hands. So the d5 and e4 seem to be pretty much under black's control. The e5 square is contested. We have one defender and one attacker. And the d4 is very contested. No one has control over that square. So we can say that white has won a pawn but given up control of his center. And Spielmann is saying, I think my center advantage is worth a pawn. And Capablanca is saying, it's worth something, but is it worth a pawn? I don't think so. So what does Capablanca do to hold on to that pawn?
He plays 6b4.
Okay. Now, white is saying, I can just hold on to this pawn. And I'm going to have a pawn advantage. Now, in the hands of beginners, a pawn advantage is not much. But in the hands of someone like Capablanca, a pawn can be worth the game. He can nurse a single pawn, an advantage of a single pawn to victory. That's how good he was. It's amazing how good he was. So he's saying, I'm going to keep this pawn. You can have your advantage in the center, but I'm going to keep this pawn, and I'm going to make you sorry that you gave it to me. All right, so what was black's next move?
Interesting. 6, queen to c7.
Okay, so Spielmann is saying, I'm going to protect my center. The queen is on, I don't need the queen to protect the d5 pawn because my knight on f6 is doing that already. But I'm going to double up on my pawn on e5. Now, there's another way to play this, but it'll get into complications, which I don't want to get away from our overview of the thinking process and the strategic ideas behind how these two great players are playing the game. And for example, there are other alternatives to Queen C7, but let's just focus on the moves that they actually played and why did they play them. The Queen is off the back rank, so it's developed. And it is protecting the center. It's attacking the center. In the pawn on e5, he wants to maintain that. So I've got the d5 pawn protected. I've got the e5 pawn protected. I've got an iron lock on e4. And the d4 square is contested. So therefore, no one controls it. So black still has that edge in the center. And we talk about centralization. Pieces tend, the minor pieces especially, grow stronger when they're centralized, because they have more mobility. And the more mobile you are, the more powerful you are. So we'd like to control the center, to post our pieces in the center so they become more powerful. So this is the idea behind Spielmann, is like, I'm going to take the center and develop my pieces, make them more powerful, and then I'm going to crush you. And Capablanca is saying, yeah, but is all of that worth a pawn? Because now you've given me a pawn, and I'm going to make you regret that decision. So we have two different mindsets going, two great players with different approaches to the game. This is what makes chess so entertaining to someone like myself. Is, you just think about it a little bit differently, change your perception from valuing center control versus material advantage. And how do you balance this? These two different factors, these two different elements of the game of chess, control of the center versus material. Is it worth a pawn? Is it not worth a pawn? And these two players are trying to tell us what they think. One says yes, one says no. So what was Capablanca's next move?
He played 7 bishop b2.
Okay, this looks like a funny move, right? What's it doing? Well, it's interesting. If that c pawn on c3 rather moves, the bishop will be attacking the center, including the e5 square, which Spielmann dearly wants to hold. And if you try to break up that pawn structure that white has, c3, b4, and c5, with a move like a5, which I'm not suggesting is a good move, but a5 would take on b4, then take on c3, and the knight can take on b4 now. And so maybe that you win your pawn back. But in that case, the bishop on b2 would be very well developed. So this is another trade-off of ideas. Can I win the pawn back, but at what cost? So how did Spielmann respond?
He responded with 7 bishop to e6.
Okay, very classical maneuver. So he's developing a piece, increasing its orientation towards the center, so its mobility and power is increased the closer it gets to the center. And it's also protecting the pawn on d5. So now Spielmann is saying, I have pawns on d5 and e5, and I'm adequately protecting them. So this will maintain my central advantage. And he's not so interested in the pawn, regaining the pawn. He doesn't really care so much about the pawn. He's going to say, okay, all of my pieces will be posted well, my center will be strong, and I will overpower you. So how does Capablanca respond?
8 knight b to d2.
Okay, so this is a good move in the sense that, the c3 square is taken away from the knight, so d2 is the natural move, the natural square for the knight to move to, because now it influences the e4 square. That the pawn on d5 and the knight on f6 are attacking that e4 square, but now white has a knight, putting a little bit of curiosity into the question, who controls that square? So far it's still black, but white is up to something, or might be up to something, in terms of contesting that control. So it's a good move. It connects the queen and rook. Never underestimate getting the pieces off their first rank so that the queens and rooks get connected. Because then the rook, which was sitting tucked in the corner at the beginning of the game, it can now come into play. So this is a classic matchup of central control versus winning material. And then once you win material, you've got to catch up in your development and catch up in your contesting the center. So Spielmann played.
He played 8 bishop e7.
Okay. Now, what's the good move and bad move about that? Well, I would suggest that the bishop e7 is a classical developing move. What's he preparing? Because these guys think more than one move ahead. He's playing the bishop to e7 to get it off the bank rank. And that prepares his ability to castle, which would connect his rooks and very nearly complete his development. So he's saying, I got center control, develop my pieces, I'm going to castle my king to safety, and then I'm going to start the fireworks. So Spielmann is playing just ideal chess from the classical point of view. And the only problem is he's lost a pawn. So who's right? What's that pawn worth? So I would think that Capablanca would respond in kind. He would play
Bishop e2.
for the same reasons. Bishop e2 and bishop e7 are pretty much the same kind of move for the same reasons, to prepare castling. Get your king to safety because the fireworks are coming. All right. So what did Spielmann do?
Spielmann castles.
Yeah, and I bet Capablanca castles.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So now we've pretty much almost, black has completed its development almost, except the rook on a1 has not moved. And white is lagging just a little bit behind in development because the queen is still on the back rank and the rook on a1 has not moved. But it's not a serious loss of time, but it is a loss of time. So black has an element of time, advantage in the element of time, and an advantage in the element of center control. White has this one pawn material advantage. So who's winning? Who's losing? Or is the position equal? So what does Spielmann play?
He plays rook a to d8.
Okay, so now his development is complete. He's moved the only piece that was on the back rank to start the game. All of them have moved at least once. So now he's also moving it to where? To the center, to control the center. It's another piece that supports the pawn on d5. Possibly it's advanced to d4. Who knows? I'm not predicting it. I'm not saying it's a good move, but it has that potential now. And that if that pawn moved, the bishop on e6 would have more scope. Its power would increase because its mobility would increase. Now, so that's in the air. It's not a threat right now, but it's in the air. So rook a1 to d8 is pretty much a good move. The only drawback is it weakens the protection of the a7 pawn, but the a7 pawn is not under any threat at all. So really, who cares about the downside of that move? It all has upside. It has plenty of upside. It's a good move. So what did Capablanca do?
11 queen c2.
Okay, so now Capablanca has come one step closer to catching up in terms of development. His queen has now left the back rank. This leaves only his rook on a1 that has not moved off its original square on the first rank of the board. So if he moves that rook next, he will have completed his development. So he's only a tempo behind. So this is, and if you just wait until Capablanca catches up and equalizes in the center, then he's just got an extra pawn. You got nothing to show for it. So what's Spielmann going to do about that, Chris?
He plays bishop to g4.
Okay, bishop to g4. A very interesting maneuver. Now, the reason I say it's interesting because the obvious drawback is he's moved that piece twice. So that's an element of time. He's moved it to b6 and then to g4, when ideally, perhaps, he could have moved it to g4 in just one move. So that's a cost of one tempi, one half ply, one option that you could have chosen a different move. But what's the upside of it? and now attacks the knight on f3, which is testing the control of e5. And what's really more important, what's more devious, is that if they can force the knight to move, that bishop on e2 will be subject to capture. So you've got some threats in the air already. And this is, okay, Spielmann saying, I've completed my development, it's time for me to attack. So he's invaded Capablanca's side of the board. His bishop is gone from his side of the board on e6 to Capablanca's side of the board on g4. And that's got to be dealt with, doesn't it? How do you deal with that? What does Capablanca do?
He deals with it directly by playing 12e4.
So now Capablanca says, I've made all my moves to develop my pieces, except for, okay, I haven't moved my rook on a1. But now I'm going to blow up the center. You've been controlling the e4 square all game. I'm sick of it. Now I'm going to fight the e4 square. And I'm threatening your d5 square, which you were so happy about. You were so happy you had that pawn on d5. It was controlling the center, it was pressuring e4. Well, now I'm contesting your d5 square. So now the center position is a little bit up in the air. It's not so clear that black has the center advantage anymore. And Capablanca waited until he had completed or nearly completed his development before he initiated central action. Before he took action in the center, he got his king to safety. He castled. You don't want the king in the center of the board when you start to have fireworks in the center. You start trading pieces or pawns in the center. You don't want your king hanging around, so he got his king to safety, and then and only then did he initiate central action. e4 is a very impressive move. The only drawback that I want to point out is that the pawn on e3 helped to fend off pieces from coming into f4. And it also supported control over the d4 square. Now on e4, that pawn can't have any say in what goes on d4 or f4 anymore. So always bear in mind, pawns only advance, they don't go backwards. And you're giving up something whenever you move a pawn. And is it worth it? Often it is. So this is the questions we have to ask ourselves prior to making a move. So e4 looks to me like it's a good move. So what does Spielmann do about this return of aggressive fire?
He captures it. 12 dx e4.
Okay, so now we have some action in the center. You know, both players were wise enough to get their kings to safety before action in the center. So, interesting. I would say it's probably a good move. It's probably the right move. I can't, it's a snap judgment on my part, but I'm thinking taking in the center does clarify the position a little bit, but Spielmann's saying, hey, I've got my rook on d8. Look at that now. Now it's going all the way down to attacking the knight on d2. I've really increased the power of that piece. And white's rook is on a1. It's not there yet. Can't really fight me there. So maybe this action in the center will be to my advantage. And e4 is Spielmann's conclusion that yes, action in the center will favor black, not white. So I think it seems to me that recapturing that pawn is forced. What did Capablanca do?
13, knight takes e4.
Okay, seems simple enough to me. Had to do it. So now the position is clarified in the center to some extent. Black has the only pawn remaining in the center. That's got to be an advantage, and it's supported. It's adequately defended. So it's got to be plus in the center for white. I mean for black. I'm sorry. And And so how does black take advantage of that? What's black's next move?
13, knight takes e4.
Okay, so he's saying my knight on f6 had some control over the center, but I don't like your knight on e4. I'm going to remove it. And so the recapture is forced. I would imagine queen takes is next.
14, queen takes e4.
Okay, so now the position is easier to calculate. There's a bishop on g4 that's being attacked by the queen on e4. So you can't leave that bishop hanging. You could take the knight, but why would you do that? I'm not sure I can see a good reason for taking it. You don't just give up a bishop that's got good mobility for a knight, because you really give up. One of the drawbacks of the bishop is it has to stay in the color it starts on. And so you have two bishops, you can cover the whole board. So you don't want to give up a bishop for a knight unless you have a really good reason. But there might be another alternative besides capturing. Would you want to move it again? Probably not. You've already moved it twice. Why would you want to take a third move with the bishop, like retreating it, the bishop to h5? That just seems on principle. I've moved it 3 times now. What do I have to show for it? I'm not sure. So what did Spielmann do?
He played f5.
Yes, of course he did. This is the attacker. He's not going to waste time. Spielmann is going to say, okay, not only am I defending my bishop, I'm attacking your queen. What are you going to do about that? And I'm going to, now that pawn on f5 is also fighting for control of e4. So he's saying, I've still got the advantage in the center, and I'm going to make use, I'm going to maximize this by putting another pawn that can influence the center of the e4 square, protect my bishop so I don't lose further material, and I've opened up my rook. My rook on f8 can go to f6 and maybe enter the game with an attack on the king side. So I've increased the scope of my rook on f8. I've increased the power of that piece. And I've influenced the center. This is just, okay, the only drawback is it can't control the e6 square. And I don't know if the e6 square is going to play a role in this game. But now the f7 pawn is on f5. It's not on f7 anymore. And it has given up its control over e6. So that e6 square is crying out to a player like me, how do I occupy that? It's not defended or defendable by any pawn. So what if I could get a knight there? That would make me hungry. I would want to get a knight there really badly. But can I? So f5. Hats off. Tip of the hat to Spielmann for f5. Good move. Capablanca must move his queen. Where does he move it?
Queen to c4 check.
Yes. This is a good use. The queen must retreat. You must cost a piece of the element of time to move the queen. Can't allow it to be captured. And you're giving check. So it's not, you're forcing the king to move or a piece to intervene, which doesn't seem likely. So it looks like it's forcing the king to move. So he's moving the king while you move your queen. So it's a wash, time-wise. And the queen on c4 is still influencing the center. See, it still attacks d4, e4, and d5. And, it's still on that bishop. If that f-pawn disappears somehow, that bishop would be hanging. So the queen move to c4 with check is a good move, from what I can see. So I would say that king to h8 is forced?
Yep, king h8 is what Spielmann plays.
Okay, so what does Capablanca do? I'm guessing rook a d1.
Yep.
Okay, so that completes Capablanca's development. So now the rook on d8, which was feeling superior to the rook on a1, is now faced with an even adversary. So all of that that smugness that black could have had because it had completed its development first, well, that's gone. So we're equal now in terms of development. In terms of center control, the d5 square is contested. The e4 square looks like black pretty much has it. It's contested. So the pawn on e5 remains the only pawn in the center. But black's center dominance is no longer dominance. It's more like I've got an advantage, but a slight advantage. And is that slight advantage worth a pawn? It's becoming less clear. It seems more and more like Capablanca is hanging on to his pawn and not paying any consequences. But look at that pawn duo on e5 and f5. Now, someone like me looks at something like that and says, that's I've got to be careful, because that looks like it wants to advance further. That duo wants to get to e4 and f4 and e3. It wants to keep coming. So if that pawn duo starts to steamroll down into my position, it can open up and make my king safety less secure. So I'm thinking now that, and this is all part of the aggressiveness of Spielmann. And Capablanca is saying, okay, I completed my development. I've got an extra pawn. Yeah, you got a little advantage here, and but I'm not that afraid. Whatever you got, I got an answer for it. So, Rook A D1 seems to complete Capablanca's development. What is Spielmann going to do about it?
16 E4.
Okay, now this is very consistent. Because now he still has there's only one pawn in the center. It's still black's. And it's supported by another pawn, the pawn on f5. Pawn on f5 gets a little hand. It's supporting and the pawn on e4 is attacking the knight on f3. So the knight is pretty much forced to move.
It is.
Pretty much.
Yeah, and Capablanca goes 17 knight d4.
Okay, now that's consistent. It's still in the center. And the interesting thing is that, you know how I said pawns can't move backwards? Well, knights can.
Mm-hmm.
So if the bishop on g4 takes the bishop on e2, the knight or the queen could recapture. So this is getting to be, you start to have to calculate clearly and accurately, because you don't want to lose material. You do not want to lose a piece by miscalculation. So make sure that knight to d4 isn't leaving you susceptible combinations. Like, what if I remove the two defenders and then I take the bishop on e2? Can I remove the two defenders? Probably not. But should I try? What should I do? What does Spielmann do?
He plays knight to e5.
Okay, this is just really wonderful. I love this, because the knight is now centralized. Its power has increased. So this knight on e5 is better than the knight was on c6. So the knight on c6 was good. The knight on e5 is threatening all sorts of bad action. And it looks like it can, oh, that outpost on d3 is crying out to be occupied by a knight. Oh, I want my, at White's point of view, I want my knight to go to e6. Ooh, I want to do that. Black's saying I want to move mine to d3. But not only do I want to do what I want to do, I'm attacking your queen. Can't overlook that. I'm attacking the queen on c4, so you've got to move it. That gives me a move to defend against knight e6. So what am I going to do? What does Capablanca do? His queen's attacked. What's he going to do?
Queen b3.
Okay. So now I have removed. Interesting. I'm calculating now. I have removed one of the defenders of the bishop on e2.
Yep. And Spielmann takes advantage of that right away. Bishop takes e2.
Okay, let's back up one square, because I was calculating. So I moved my queen to bishop 3, and I was thinking, what about rook takes knight? Because then there's no piece defending the bishop on e2. But the answer is white can play bishop on e2 takes bishop on g4. And if the rook on d4 takes the rook on d1, the bishop can recapture it. So there is no loss of material. And white comes out with the two bishops versus bishop and knight. So I'm sorry it took me a minute to calculate that, but okay. So Spielmann does not go in for rook takes knight, which will leave him with a advantageous position, and he plays bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes e2, forcing the recapture. I'm sure.
Yep.
Knight takes e2.
Now that knight can't go to e6.
Exactly. Very good point, Chris. That is the way that black answered the threat of knight e6 by forcing it back. And the knight on e2 is not anywhere near as good as the knight was on d4. But the knight on e2 still influencing the center, still plays a role, it's still fine, but it's not quite as strong as it was on d4. So now this material balance looks
A
good.
moment ago, I have a couple questions, Jim.
Sure.
After, if we back up just one half step, after
Okay.
Spielmann plays bishop takes e2,
Okay.
Chess Shark wants to know, and CJ as well, why not knight e6? What do you think about?
Okay.
That's kind of a complicated.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. The immediate thought that I had is that I would play bishop takes d1
Mm-hmm.
because the knight on e6 is attacking the black queen. You might assume that the queen has to move, but that isn't always a valid assumption. Actually, I've been caught several times thinking that, assuming that a piece has to move. And what about bishop takes d1 though? You take my queen, I take yours.
Wow. Yeah. I didn't notice the. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I didn't notice the backward threat of the white queen from the bishop on d1.
Right.
Fascinating. Yeah,
So
that's
then,
something that happens in a lot of blitz games to me as well. It's like a blind spot in my calculation sometimes.
yeah, it's an in between move
Mm-hmm.
when we think we have to move. We forcing black to play something, and black says, "Well, not so fast. I'll play bishop takes d1, threatening your queen. You take my queen, I'll take your queen, and I'll have a gigantic material advantage at the end."
Excellent question, CJ and Cheshire. And Shrihan, I saw your answer, and it was the same one that Jim gave. So good job on that. All right, so we are now to Capablanca just played 19 knight takes e2, recapturing.
Yeah. And so this looks like it's time for action from black. I think black is really happy, and I think white is happy.
This is a
As far
really interesting position right now, Jim,
as
for
right.
black, because I see what Spielman plays because it's right here in front of me. And
Uh-huh.
maybe if I was, analyzing a student's game, that would be what I would probably suggest if I was, sitting
Right.
analyzing a student's game. If I was playing a correspondence game where I'm going to spend, a few days thinking about something, I certainly might be looking at knight d3.
Well, that was the first thing that I had my eye on was because now you have an outpost on D3 supported by a protected pawn and supported by the rook on D8. So the knight is going to be very mobile, very nasty. A bone in the throat is what we call it in chess. And so that knight D3 is kind of like that's where I'm thinking Spielman's really happy. But there's also another move that
There's a
I bet
naughty
Spielman
move, yeah.
yes, he's got a
Yeah.
threat that I don't think he could
Knight
resist it. I
f3
think
is so
he is
is so
fine with
naughty. I would
that.
I would play knight f3 all night long in my speed chess games.
Knight
Yeah,
D3, yeah,
just
yeah,
it exposes White's king, and as Jim was saying, the rook can jump into action real fast using the elevator.
yeah.
So, but Spielman does not play knight f3. Um, Likely because he knows who he's playing against. He's playing against Capablanca.
Yes,
Ooh, yeah. If you use something,
always know your
yeah,
opponent, right?
exactly. So he plays knight g4, which is a great move.
That is that's this is a very interesting position. It is worth spending some time analyzing knight D3, knight F3, and now knight G4. All of these moves are plausible. All of these moves have some good aspects and some drawbacks. But knight f3 to me looks like it's a premature move. It doesn't seem like I have a mating follow up. So I would resist it. although it's tempting.
And also if I was if I was in Spielmann's shoes, not being nearly as good of a chess player as Spielmann is, if I was playing Capablanca, I'd probably play knight f3 just because it'd give him something to worry about at least. you know.
Right.
But yeah,
But
knight g4 gives him something
H4,
to worry about too, right? Yeah.
right, right. Look at the weakness on H2, because the E4 pawn for black has driven away the knight on F3, which was the primary protector of the H2 square. It's also protected by the king, but you don't want to use your king in the middle game as a primary defender. White attacks it with the knight on G4, but also look at what it's, by moving away from E5, it's opened up the queen diagonal. So the queen is also threatening H2. And in fact, if Capablanca does nothing, queen takes H2 will be checkmate. So this is the kind of threat you cannot ignore. You can't go about your business until you take care of what he's up to. So there's numerous ways. Don't make the mistake of playing H3, attacking the knight, because what would be the response, Chris?
Queen h2, checkmate. Yeah.
H2 checkmate. So moving the pawn doesn't help you.
Yeah.
Moving that pawn.
So,
but
Capablanca,
Capablanca's got something up his sleeve. What would be up his sleeve?
he plays knight g3.
Okay.
Places something in between the queen and h2.
Right. So this is no longer a threat immediately. But what if I could drive away that knight and open up that threat again? That's really curious. I'm spending too much time analyzing it, but I'm thinking, why don't I play f4?
Yeah, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things is when you have when you see a possibility and there's only one thing, one problem that causes that possibility not to become a reality, all you have to do is solve that one puzzle, and then your possibility can become a reality oftentimes. So it's a little chess puzzle within a chess game.
That's how the thinking process works for me. Is the knight's in my way. How do I get the knight out of my way? That's the first thought that pops into my head in these types of positions. Can I? And like h5, h4 is one possibility, but if I play h5, he can maybe stick in f3, or h3 rather. And so this is the kind where you have to have solid calculations. You can't make a mistake in this position because one move can lose the game. And this type of threat, the threat of queen takes h2, is nothing you can toy around with. You have to be precise in your calculations. So I'm just thinking, knowing Spielmann, he played f4.
He did, and you suggested that he would love way back, I think, on move 14. You suggested that he would love to get those pawns rolling forward, and
yes.
And that's precisely what he's doing.
Yeah, he went from e5 and f5 to e4 and f4. The only problem I see is that pawn on e4 is not protected anymore. So I don't know though. I don't know exactly. I won't waste time calculating. I'll just ask you, what did Capablanca do?
He played rook takes d8.
Oh, sure. Why not? Take off one of the major attacking pieces. Like if rook takes rook, then you can't lift the rook into the action like through 6 anymore. So, that's a reduction of material. And when you're a defender, you're under attack, reducing material is generally a good idea. So, rook takes rook.
Yes, and that is what Rudolf Spielmann plays. Rook takes d8.
Yeah. Now, this is can you take that pawn on e4? And if you think of one move, if you have time on your clock, always look to see if you can find something better. Because the threat is pawn takes knight, and the advance to f4 was really interesting to me because I wanted to remove that knight. from in the way from me checkmating. But now the pawn on f5 is in the way. So do I have a spare move with my knight? Or do I have another move? And I can't give up the knight, so I either must move it or do something. What did Capablanca play? I'm starting to get a headache.
He really, is showing his class here. He plays Queen E6.
Wow.
And I was still calculating the knight takes E4 idea.
Yeah, me
Yeah,
too.
and
Yeah.
it's tricky. Um, and the Queen E6 looks, superior, but I I think I probably would have played knight takes E4. I don't think I would have seen Queen E6 as a
Well,
possibility.
the really the idea behind Queen E6 is it's attacking the knight on
Mm-hmm.
G4. And again, if you want to reduce material, you want to give up your knight for his knight. Well, then what kind of material advantage does Black have? Or I mean, attack does Black have? Because you still have that extra pawn, that protected pawn on C5. That's still money in the
Yeah.
bank. So trade off all these material, you win the ending. There's no question. So this what I am really admiring about this is Capablanca is saying, okay, I'll trade knights with you. I won't take my knight away. I'll trade. You take my knight, I'll take yours. That's further reduction of material, further uh, and towards the end game, further towards Capablanca activating his advantage and seeing and using his extra pawn
He's
to
got 4 pawns against 2 on the queen side.
right.
Uh,
So virtually any ending is
yes.
won for so he's going to get closer to the end game with this maneuver. It's really, really good.
It's a really good move, and yeah, like I said, honestly, I'm pretty convinced I would love to be able to play moves like that. But that's kind of the way Capablanca. When I study his games, the moves seem so obvious. There's always these couple of moves that seem so obvious that I know I wouldn't have played. And that's
You know,
why I'm learning from him. I'm always learning from Capablanca. His moves are easily explained. Um,
that's an excellent point, Chris.
yeah,
Because the one thing there is a simplicity to Capablanca's games, but we undervalue his ability to as a tactician sometimes because this is a tactical response to this attack that Black Spielmann, the great attacker, is unleashing an attack on White's castle's king, and this is a tactical response. This is not a strategic response. So we always admire Capablanca's game, and Chris, like everyone else that's ever studied his games, is learning, constantly learning from Capablanca. And there is a simplicity to his moves, a logic to his moves that is understandable in ways that's, that not all games are as understandable as Capablanca's. And so they're so good to study. They teach you so many lessons. But this is one of the things, and I might be like Chris, I might have just taken that pawn on e4, depending on how much time I had to calculate. I might not have seen queen e6 at all. I might have been so focused on taking the pawn on e4 with my knight. And then whatever Spielmann had up his sleeve, we don't know yet, but, he would probably be in his element and happy as a clam attacking. And the queen e6, I'm not so sure Spielmann saw it. Maybe he did. I don't know. I can't speak for him. But the attack, say, go ahead, take my knight, I'll take yours, is just magnificent. Not something that would have naturally occurred to me. Maybe after a long period of study, I would have seen it and played it. But I think Capablanca had seen this possibility far, far earlier than Chris or I would have. So Capablanca has played queen e6. What does Spielmann do?
we have FX G3, and then of
Yeah.
course Queen takes G4.
Okay. Now there seems to be you could restore material balance by pawn takes pawn on h2. That's with check. and it temporarily restores the material balance in that both sides would have equal number of pawns. But it's a very precarious pawn. Yeah, I don't think it will last too long on h2. Maybe it will. Another option is pawn takes f2 check. Now that would allow rook takes, and that requires further analysis. And I don't know. I'll just ask, what did Spielmann play?
He plays gx(h2) check.
Okay. Very, very logical, very consistent.
And then king h1 is the only move.
That's forced, right?
And then
how do you follow up on this now?
This is an interesting position again, and Spielmann plays 24 queen e5.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It protects the pawn on e4. It's still protecting the pawn on h2. It centralizes the queen, so the queen's mobility has increased. The power of the queen has increased. So that's an ideal post for the queen if it can't be driven away, and it doesn't look like it could be driven away easily. Not only that, but it pins the pawn on c3 to the bishop, so the pawn can't move to c4, which would increase the scope of the bishop on b2 and it's directly pointing at black's king. So, you don't want white to play c4 if you're black. So he's pinning that pawn on c3. It's all the things I said about the queen's increase in power, but that's another subtler consideration why that looks like a good move to me. So queen e5 exclam. Now what is, well, I think an obvious move would be to attack the pawn again. What blank could play? Yeah,
rook e1.
Yeah, just attack it again. How do you defend it? But I would think Spielmann thought of that.
And yeah, he did think of it, and he realized the best defense is a good offense. Plays rook d2.
Rook d2. Okay. Now I will point out that he's attacking both the bishop on b2 and the pawn on f2. So that's a very dangerous move for white. It is definitely an attacking move. It's putting the rook on the 7th rank, which rooks love to go to the 7th rank. And they love, because there's lots of little pawns to pick off, and sometimes there's pieces to munch on. But it seems like there's one drawback, which would be rook takes e4, because that attacks the queen.
And it's a big drawback because white's queen is backward defending d1. If white's queen wasn't defending d1, then rook takes d4 would be a huge mistake because of a back rank mate threat.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah. Okay, that's a good point, because rook takes e4 would be a bad move if rook takes d1 was checkmate.
Yeah.
we could say that with confidence.
Yeah, but rook takes e4 is great because the queen is on the d1 to h5 diagonal. So right. 26 rook takes e4, threatening black's queen.
So the queen has to retreat, or maybe you can trade it by rook d1, queen takes d1, rook takes e4. But that's just increasing Capablanca's advantage, getting closer and closer to the ending.
It really,
so
yeah.
So where does the queen retreat to?
Queen to c7.
Well, that's logical. It's back where it was. It's been forced out, but it also protects the bishop on e7. It prevents a queen check on c8. All of these are good things. It's a good defensive move. And you still have the rook on f7 attacking the bishop and the pawn. So it seems to me that white has a choice of how do you defend both at the same time. And if you play rook to e2, which would defend both at the same time, guess what the rook on e2 would be doing? It would be blocking the white queen's control over the d1 square. And allowing the rook to play to d1. So rook e2, although it would be normally a nice defensive move, defending both the bishop on b2 and the pawn on f2, is out of the question in this position, because rook d1 would allow black to win. immediately.
Yep.
So I can't defend both of them, I don't think. What does Capablanca do?
He plays bishop to c1.
Okay, bishop to c1. He's giving up the pawn on f2. He's saying, well, I have to give up something. So right now, the material advantage in this position, white has 2, 4, 6 pawns, and black has 5. And that pawn on h2 doesn't have a long half-life. It's going to be taken at some point, I would think. So, and white is now attacking the bishop. So you could snatch the pawn on a2 or f2. And I would take the pawn on f2.
What Spielmann plays. Rook takes f2.
Yeah, because f2 kind of makes that. Now you can play. The threat is rook f1.
Checkmate again. Yeah.
Mate again, and taking the pawn on a2 would not have that threat. So I would take the the pawn on f2, and Spielmann did. Now there must be something up Capablanca's sleeve here.
He's got a really nice move here. And it is 28 bishop f4, interfering with the queen's defense of h2.
So rook f1 is no longer a threat because king takes h2.
Plus, of course, it's attacking black's queen.
Right, but if I give check, I don't have to worry about my queen, but the king could just take the pawn and escape check, and then my queen's attacked, and I've lost the pawn. And the bishop is in the game. This looks bad for black.
And we can't forget that white's rook is still threatening the bishop on e7, so the queen can't just move anywhere.
Wherever it wants, right. Whoa, this looks like bishop f4 might be a decisive move. I can't find an answer for black.
That is a puzzle-worthy move right there. That really is. I'm going to have to use that in future chess classes. What is white's best move?
Well, the whole maneuvers, bishop to c1, was played with the intent of playing bishop f4. I'm sure Capablanca saw this. And I don't know, but he might have saw it before he played queen e6. Because pawn takes g3, queen takes g4. Those are easily calculated moves. Pawn takes pawn check, king over, easily calculated. And then what are you going to do? Queen e5, maybe that's a little harder to see, but probably not for someone like Capablanca. Rook takes e4. These are. But then the rook on d2, how do you dislodge it? Bishop c1 and seeing bishop f4. So, this is the kind of moves that seem like they're just, luckily, white had this move, bishop to f4. There's nothing lucky about it.
No. Yeah. When you guys study other Capablanca games, and I hope you do, you're gonna see this kind of thing happening a lot. It wasn't because he was the luckiest guy ever.
Right. Okay, but the game is not over. It seems like.
So the queen needs to move.
The queen needs to move.
But it also needs to defend
7.
The bishop.
D8 looks like the right square.
D8 might be the only square that does, right?
Right. You can't move to D7 because the queen would take you.
So queen D8 is what's played.
Okay, yeah, that looks like almost a box move. By box, I mean the only move. Okay.
And now,
how does white play? King takes h2, or that and then it's still a game. I mean, white has an extra pawn, an extra protected pass pawn, but it would be a long ending, and maybe that you could take the pawn on a2 then if you just play king takes h2. So there's something up Capablanca's sleeve here.
He has something up his sleeve. Does anybody see? You can type it in the chat if you think you see.
Yeah.
What Capablanca's next move is. He has something up his sleeve for sure.
I can't type in chat, but I think I know it. I'm going to say it in a minute, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to type it in the chat. because it's a beautiful move, but it's been set up.
Mm-hmm. Remember what we were talking about? If there's something that's preventing you from doing something, right? If there's one problem, there it is. Benjamin sees it. He says Rook takes e7,
Great.
and so does
Absolutely.
Shrihan. Good job.
Because what can black do? If you take it, queen c8,
Mm-hmm.
check. Uh-oh.
Yep.
Lights out. So that bishop wasn't defended. We thought queen d8 defended it,
Yep.
but it wasn't defending it.
Yep.
It was insufficient defense. You might have had to play rook takes f4 instead of queen
Might
d8.
have.
And that's a lost position.
Such beautiful tactics by Capablanca.
Yeah, I just don't want us to underestimate Capablanca's tactical abilities because he was such a strong positional strategic player.
Mm-hmm.
And we sometimes forget this guy didn't miss much.
No. Yeah.
This guy saw a lot more than most of us do. And even the best, this is against Spielmann, one of the best attackers of the modern era, and some would say of all time, a great, aggressive, attacking player. And Capablanca saw deeper than Spielmann did.
Yep. But Capablanca would become world champion, and but as I said in the beginning, Rudolf Spielmann had an even score against Capablanca.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So
not too many people can say that. Yeah. It's like having a plus score against Fischer or something.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
So what do you do now?
He plays queen f8.
Well, that has a threat on the bishop on f4. Sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of. Not really. Because there's still black back rank mate issues.
Yep.
So
and then Capablanca simply plays queen takes g7 check.
What? But I can just take it. Queen takes queen.
And then if queen takes queen?
Oh, rook to e8 check.
Yeah.
That forces black has no choice but to play queen g8.
Uh-huh.
And then bishop to e5 check. And it's one move from me.
Yeah.
So this is a wonderful ending. What a nice little ending.
What a nice little treat. And Spielmann saw it, so he resigned.
Yeah.
Because he saw...
He sees it first. Took me a second, but I'm sure he saw it as soon as Capablanca played it.
And who knows how long back Capablanca thought of this. Always hard to tell with Capablanca. He had a vision of the future that was very precise.
Yes, and his ability to calculate, I think, is one of his characteristics that has been underestimated. And I think that he needs to be thought of as, not only in terms of a strategic precision, positional sense, but also as a wonderful tactician in his own right. Because look at this beautiful ending. This conclusion to this beautifully played game is a tactic. And it's not a one mover. It's queen takes g7 check, which we would hesitate to play. I thought for a minute, wait a minute, what am I missing? Because queen can just take g7, but then rook takes. The queen is forced back to g8. And you know what? I didn't mention it at the time, but remember back in the middle of the game when white played queen c4 check and black had to play king h8? Mm-hmm. And I didn't mention it at the time, but I probably should have. That left back rank threats as part of the, because on g8 the king was actually a little bit safer than it was on h8. Mm-hmm. It was not as exposed to so many back rank threats. And this would not have been possible if the king had been on g8. You couldn't play queen takes g. If the king had been on g8, queen takes g7 check, would be met by queen takes
Mm-hmm.
queen, and rook e8 check would allow either the queen to come back or the king just to go to f7. So it's the fact that the king was in the corner that allows this combination. Now, I'm not saying he saw all of this when he played queen c4 check. I'm just saying that that's another factor in king safety
Mm-hmm.
that you want considering, because your king on h8 is in the corner square, has very little maneuverability. It only has 3 possible squares to go to. And if it's on g8, it has 5 squares it can move to. And that can make all the difference between winning and losing sometimes. So when you force your opponent into the corner, it's, it may not be decisive, but it is something to consider. The king is actually more mobile on g8 than it is on h8. So just file that away for later,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
might see other games.
Absolutely. What a fantastic lesson this was. I've looked at this game a couple times in the past. Nothing really recently, and I learned so much more by looking at the game with you today, Jim. So and I know everybody else did as well. What a what a fantastic game, and
That was a great game.
Capablanca is just such a gift. You know, his chess is just such a gift to us because every move makes sense. There's nothing he ever did on the chessboard that didn't make sense. And very, you don't have to really stretch to try and make sense of it. He had a very simple, sensible approach, but did it at the highest level ever. And Rudolf Spielmann, who knows how good of a chess player he would have been if he didn't have so much turmoil in his being involved in living through 2 world wars. That changes people. Capablanca had it much easier at the time. He grew up in Cuba, came to America, played college baseball even. Capablanca played baseball. I forget which Ivy League school he went to.
I don't know top of my head either, but
Yeah,
that's a good
yeah,
too.
but
But he moved in different circles.
yeah,
You
yeah.
and Spielman,
Capablanca was in the Hollywood circles, right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. He was playing chess with movie stars while Spielman was just trying to survive. And remember what I
yeah.
said at the beginning. Spielman wrote a very incredible manuscript. He finished it to get his ticket to America to safety, and it got lost somewhere. So I wonder where that is. I wonder if it'll ever be discovered and published. I hope so. I hope
I
so.
hope so.
Yeah. Jim, thank you so
That's it.
much for
It's my pleasure, Chris. Anytime you ask, I'll try to
this
be
was
there.
this was just we've had a lot of good times together. I think
Yeah.
this was my favorite lesson that you've given us
Oh, good.
out of all of them so far. So just incredible. Thank you so much. And
Well, I can't take all the credit for Capablanca's move.
yeah, but just your way of explaining it so well. It's I don't know what book I discovered this in. Originally when I first saw it, but whatever book it was not written as well as your on the fly analysis.
Well, this is a famous tournament, and I'm sure I played this game over in the past, because, all those players are part of my chess culture. When I was growing up, I was studying the gamesters, and, like Morphy, like Lasker, like Capablanca, like Alekian afterwards, and on and on and on. Botvinnik, he was such a strong player for so long. And all of these have been part, because they got started because Bobby Fischer became world champion in 1972. That's the first tournament game that I played, 1972. And, but, then this whole world of chess literature opened up to me. And I could see the games of the past, but played by these wonderful practitioners. And some of them are different types of players. They have different styles, and like Spielmann has a different style than Capablanca. But you can see that Capablanca's ability to calculate was equal to at least Spielmann's. And Spielmann was a great player, great attacker, very aggressive, and Capablanca was not as aggressive. But his moves were calmer, surer, and his track record of success was greater because of it. So his genius cannot be diminished. I don't think, however many years pass, a century and more later, we can play over his game and go, wow, that was beautiful. So thank you for showing me that game again. I'm sure I've played it over before, but it is wonderful to relive these games.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's like stepping back in time.
Yes.
And I'm glad that you had us elaborate a little bit more on the time period as well,
Yeah.
because it's stories that help students remember the context and remember the lesson more. It's stories, and every chess game is a story, and every player is a storyteller.
When we compare players from different eras, you have to put them in the context of their era. How dominant was Capablanca in his time? So don't compare the quality of his games to the quality of Magnus Carlsen's games. Just by nature of the advance of chess science, Carlsen plays a better game, but he stands on the shoulders of giants like Capablanca before him. So this is part of the understanding of chess history and the understanding of chess culture, which all of us can enjoy. And it doesn't matter what country you're from. It doesn't matter what language you speak. The chess can be shared worldwide. So this is part of my enthusiasm for the game remains as much as it was when I was a young player, thinking that I was the next Bobby Fischer, which turned out not to be the case.
Well, you didn't end up too far off, right? And actually, we're glad you weren't, because I think you're much happier as Jim Eade than Bobby Fischer. But that's another story. Hey, all of you still here, and there's a lot of you in this chat. Jim Eade has his own YouTube channel. It's the Eade Foundation's channel, and he brings on a guest once a week, every Friday, and has a very interesting show. I encourage you, we're going to be ending this broadcast, but I want you to immediately, after you hit the like button, give us a lot of likes, because this is my favorite lesson I've ever done with Jim. Give us likes, and then go to Jim's channel, the Eade Foundation. Go there right away and hit the subscribe button, and you will be happy that you did. You will be happy that you did. All right.
And if you're
Jim,
on Facebook,
thank you so much.
There is an Eade Facebook page as well. And thank you, Chris. I'll say goodbye now. Thanks.
And everybody who tuned in today, thank you again. I will see you tomorrow. This is Chris Torres, and this has been the Free Online Chess Camp and Daily Chess Musing. See you guys tomorrow.